Hi and welcome to another episode of Research in Profile, brought to you by the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Sebastian Kaempf and I'm joined here today by Dr. Emma Hutchison. Emma is a researcher in the School of Political Science and International Studies, and her research focuses predominantly on the topics of emotions and trauma, with particular reference to security, humanitarianism, as well as international aid. Emma, thanks for coming here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And obviously we're having you here because you have just published your new book with Cambridge University Press's very prestigious international studies series. The book is entitled Affective Communities in World Politics, Collective Emotions After Trauma.
Yeah.
So congratulations on the book.
No,
first
thank you
of
very
all.
much.
It's an intriguing title, Affective Communities in World Politics. What got you interested in these topics?
Yeah, so I guess ever since the start of my career, or really as an undergraduate and an honours student, I've had a long-standing interest in community in world politics, and in particular in how communities can be constructed in times of human need. So humanitarian communities, I guess, was primarily what got me into trying to understand the concept of community, how communities are constituted, whether it's within the state, at the state level, and also beyond the state. And from there, I really got thinking about, what is it that drives the humanitarian impulse? What is it that makes us feel for people in times of human need? How do we perceive of others' suffering? And for me, that really came back to emotions and how we feel about suffering, about witnessing suffering. So from there, I got thinking about, what role do emotions play in binding us together, in pulling people together, and I guess also in constituting detachments between people. So, from there, I started to embark and looked into literatures on emotions and affects in social and political life. And the book, I guess, is an attempt to really draw together a very broad range of literatures from feminist theory, sociology, political theory, psychology, history, sociology, and many more disciplines in an attempt to try and understand, how is it that, or how do emotions and affects bind us together, and what role do they play in constituting not just communities, but also a sense of responsibility, and also, I guess, security communities after different types of catastrophe. Yeah.
I mean, you already pointed to the wealth of these different rich sources that go through this book, and it's really impressive. But before we go in depth into all of these different topics, I actually want to draw our attention to the cover picture that we have on the book.
It's a wonderful cover, and I'm very grateful to an Australian artist, Ben Quilty, for giving permission for us to use his image. This image is taken from a series of portraits that he did of returned servicemen and women, Australian servicemen and women who returned from Afghanistan. He was actually an official war artist with the Australian Defence Force in Afghanistan, and he went and spent time with the troops. And when he returned, he undertook a study of servicemen and women who had returned, and he asked them, he wanted to do a portrait study, and he asked them to pose in different positions that they felt reflected how they feel after their service. And predominantly that was one of trauma, and they felt traumatized by their experience. So many of the portraits, and not actually the one that is featured on my cover, which is of Troy Park, many of the portraits are very literal, very little representations of the body in pain. We felt that this one was perhaps the most appropriate for the cover, but they're a wonderful series of portraits, and when I saw them, I was really hopeful that I could have one on the cover. So
it certainly draws you in, right? So I think, great, well chosen. Now, in the opening of your book, you write, and I quote, that few phenomena in world politics are as central, yet as underexplored as trauma and emotions. Why have emotions been absent in our studies and scholarship about world politics, and why is that absence problematic?
So traditionally, emotions have been have essentially been demonized and expunged from political analysis. And this really emerges from a long tradition in Western philosophy and political theory. Emotions were kind of the opposite of good political reason and judgment. And it was emotions that is precisely what impels people towards violence and harm. So the thinking was that emotions essentially need to be taken out of the political equation. Emotions we need to set them aside and come up with, I guess, policy options and enact political behaviours that are rational and emotion-free. Ironically, whilst also realising that emotions are central to sometimes aberrant political behaviours, it's ironic because you can't essentially take them out of the political equation. Emotions underlie, emotions are an inevitable and inescapable aspect of human experience, and this is what my book shows. And it's because of that we need to take them seriously and consider how they actually underlie, all political perceptions, behaviours, and policy options.
Yeah, interesting. Now, further down the book, you talk about the paradox of trauma, the ability of trauma to, on the one hand, break communities, but also to form communities. I think, given how central this is to your argument, I'd like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, so there's really two key aspects that are central to this paradox. On the one hand, a lot of literature, particularly a lot of literature from psychology and emerging from post-Holocaust studies, they contend that trauma is an isolating and solitary experience, that trauma detaches us from our social reality, and as Maurice Blanchot writes in The Writing of Disaster, trauma is, as he writes, trauma is what escapes the very possibility of experience. Kathy Carruth, a very prominent trauma scholar, similarly says trauma is an experience that's strangely missed. It's something that we can never entirely comprehend. We can't. It's ineffable. It's something that we can't. We find it difficult to express, understand, and so trauma survivors often come back to the moment of their trauma in an attempt to understand it. But really key here is that trauma is seen as an isolating, solitary experience. It breaks communities precisely because it detaches you from the communal connections in which you're embedded. At the same time, and we see it very often in politics, world politics, domestic politics, trauma can rally people together. People can be pulled together around pain, around others' pain, around witnessing pain. So the paradox of trauma, this paradox is central to my research puzzle insofar that I try and understand this disjuncture and how is it that trauma can on one hand be isolating and solitary, emotionally ineffable perhaps, but at the same time can constitute communities so powerfully. And my contribution to sort of understanding this paradox and this puzzle is really to delve down the road of emotions and to say, how is it, what is it about the emotions of trauma that can seem perhaps to survivors so individual and solitary, yet at the same time can seep out and constitute collectives and political communities.
Great. So if emotions matter, then of course, one of the questions that people would ask or scholars would ask is but how do we go about researching emotions, something that's so intangible in a way, right? Now, in your book, you point to a lot of new and exciting scholarship that has started to embark on these questions, and you outline the kind of methods that they have embarked on. But you in your book, you have chosen a different path, namely that you study and analyze emotions through representations. So the question I want to ask is why is that? Why have you chosen that kind of path? And what does such an examination actually look like?
Yeah, so as you said, there's a lot of literature, and particularly growing at the moment, looking at, how recognising that emotions are so important in social and political life. How is it that we go about studying them? And there's a lot of debate, disagreement in this area. But as you said, my key contribution lies in proposing, and I show how I think a study of representations can be helpful in moving debates forward. So it's not the only way to go about studying emotions, but my study looks at representations. So by that I mean the images, text, bodily gestures, any sort of symbolic practice or representational mode through which actions, and in my case trauma, is communicated. So representations essentially provide a vehicle or a medium through which, in my case, trauma is represented, communicated. And representations, I argue, are key because they're precisely the way through which emotions are also communicated. So it's through representations, through the images and text we receive every day, that's how we create meaning and create emotional meaning. And these different types of emotional meanings, they can act as catalysts, or they can help to produce the conditions through which particular political actions become possible. So the representations for me, they embody and enact emotions, and they're really how we receive different emotional messages and how different events, political phenomena, they can gain emotional resonance and in turn political credence.
Yeah, and I know that so much wonderful conceptual and theoretical work is done by you in this book. When we look at the theoretical and conceptual part of the book, which is very substantive, and before we come to the case studies, I want to get a bit of a sense of what the major conceptual contributions of the book are.
So essentially, if I had to sum it up, I would say the book shows how the emotional dimensions of representing trauma can constitute forms of political community at various different levels, from the local to the global. And by this, I essentially look at how different representations or representations of different types of trauma, they attain and attribute forms of social meaning. And in doing so, they create social and collective understandings. And it's these meanings and understandings, they can gain political traction, or I argue they gain political traction precisely through the types of emotional resonance they have. Perhaps it might help if I go into the case studies and explain how this dynamic takes shape.
Because
more
I think
concretely.
No, absolutely, and I would have commended you on being to the spot already on that particular hard question I just asked you. But let's look into the cases. Absolutely, I mean there's 3 case studies that you have chosen. Just for the sake of our viewers to be on the same page as us. One is the Bali bombing of 2002, the second one, the 2004 Southeast Asian tsunami, and the third is China's so-called century of national humiliation. And actually the fourth, I have to correct myself, is South Africa's attempt to come to terms with its own traumatic experience of apartheid. So maybe the first question here would be, why those 4 cases?
So to begin with, the 4 cases are used, I should say all of the cases, to return to my key, theoretical contribution, all of the cases really show how, again, the emotional dimensions of representing trauma can constitute communities. But I use these cases in very different ways, and I actually do use them in 3 different ways. The first case, that of the Bali bombing in 2002, in which 202 people were killed in Kuta in Bali, 88 of whom were Australian. In this case, I'm looking at how the emotions associated with a national trauma essentially reconstituted or consolidated a previously existing and established community. So in this case, it was that of the sovereign state and the nation, and often we find it is at the level of the nation. And there are a range of different, so I trace in this how the emotions associated with media images and media texts reconstituted the Australian national community, or pulled them together, rallied them together around sentiments such as, anger, fear, anxiety, grief. And I look at how after a trauma such as this, communities can sometimes be constituted, or they're often constituted, I would argue, in very insular, bounded ways. So in essence, this is a type of trauma that closes off a form of community. It closes off the boundaries, often creates and perpetuates us and them type of dichotomies, which can sometimes orientate a community in retributive ways. In this case, that's not essentially the argument, but I do draw links between how the Bali bombing constituted the Australian community and created a sense of solidarity that perhaps led to Australia's involvement in the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah.
And you want to say a bit more about the other three cases as well?
Sure. So the second case, which is really quite different, is I look at the trauma associated with the 2004 Southeast Asian tsunami. And the reason I chose this case originally is because I really wanted to look at, so I'd looked at how a national community can be constituted, but one of my key passions has been looking at how can we constitute and transform community beyond the nation state. So I thought at the time this was a really it might make an insightful case to study how is it that, what was it about the tsunami that mobilised such enormous transnational solidarity? At the time, it mobilised the largest transnational aid community ever, constituted by nation states, international organisations and individuals. So in this case, I look at, again, media representations and associated texts, and I look at how essentially they helped to constitute, or the role they played, the types of meanings and social understandings they created in order to mobilise it, to help mobilise the community. And I focus in particular on Western media representations. I looked at images, front page images of the New York Times, in order to get a sense of, the emotional dynamics at stake and the role they played in creating the conditions through which this aid community emerged. And I found, at the time somewhat surprisingly, that in fact, even a newspaper such as the New York Times actually represented the tsunami through very stereotypical patterns of imaging developing world others. And in doing so, they really tapped into what's known as a politics of pity. So they mobilised sort of Western viewers around, as I said, stereotypical understandings of developing world others as passive and powerless, in need of urgent aid, in need of the West's help. And in doing so, there's particular political and ethical issues at stake. On one hand, and what I hoped was what you'd find this community was transformative and, a revolutionary type of community that shows how people can be pulled together around, empathetically around other people's pain. But then, on the other hand, given that it was mobilised, the aid community was mobilised through such stereotypical depictions, it's somewhat sobering, I guess, to think that it was actually, mobilised through pity and sympathy rather than, I guess, a more empathetic understanding of how other people's experience disaster. So that was the second case. And the third case, I hope I'm not taking too much time to get through these.
No, it's fascinating.
The third case was added on towards the end, and I'm happy with how it turned out. I hope readers are as well. It's possibly a little ambitious. I fear it's an ambitious chapter, but what I really wanted to do in it is think about, try and consider if there's ways of representing trauma and perceiving of trauma that can constitute communities in less retributive ways, and in ways that sort of push communities away from perhaps maladaptive political practices after traumatic events and histories, into ways that sort of are more forward-looking political outlooks that are, I guess, inspired by critical reflection upon trauma and from where it's emerged. So in this chapter I propose, and it's a chapter that is sort of half theoretical, half empirical. It's a chapter, so in the chapter I propose and explore the possibilities and potentials of what I call a politics of grief. So I look at, first of all, China, and these are not, I set these two cases, China and South Africa, not as, I don't want them to be seen as contrasts or opposites. I kind of would like them to be seen, although I know there's death of the author, as along a spectrum of understanding sort of responses to trauma. So on one hand, I looked at China, which it's not the perfect case, but this is inspired by my previous study of Chinese. I look at China's history, what they call the century of national humiliation, which began at the start of the Opium War and really ended, say, at the end of World War II, but I sort of draw it to the end of 1949 with the rise of the CCP. And this, I guess, I look at how representations of the century of humiliation have essentially been used in China's case as an overtly political tool to actually constitute community. So these representations, they've helped to consolidate Chinese community and Chinese nationalism. But I sort of look at how, in doing this, in constituting community around sort of very singular representations of trauma, such was the case with the Bali bombing as well, how this can lead to retributive political practices and mindsets. So there's a lot of literature that looks at how trauma and traumatic legacies and histories, when they're dwelt upon and commemorated in ways that really celebrate the trauma rather than reflecting upon it and seeking to move forward. Communities are constituted, again, in very insular ways, in ways that lead towards actually a search for recognition and status. They would like their trauma recognised. And I argue that's such the case with China. And in turn, communities are really unable to move forward. They're stuck at the trauma. Vamick Volkan calls this chosen trauma, in where a community is so constituted by what's happened, by pain, by the emotions associated with pain, that they can't really move forward. Again, it's not entirely the case with China, but I do elaborate in the book a little bit how perhaps this can play a role, or perhaps it should be considered in I guess, foreign policy circles, essentially. So from there, the second half of the chapter moves towards South Africa. And again, not a perfect example, but I use South Africa as a sort of tool to explain and question, what is it that how can communities acknowledge trauma and work through trauma in a way that pushes them towards more forward-looking political outlooks, and doesn't keep them inward-looking. And so I look at, in particular, the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, and how, as a tool, it sort of allowed the entire South African community, survivors, witnesses, bystanders, to collectively acknowledge and mourn what they went through. And I looked specifically at some of the tools through which they did that, and I argue that it might be one way of conceptualising a politics of grief. So it's one way of prompting communities to move forward after trauma, but to reflect upon it in order to move forward.
Wow, empirically extremely rich. Emotions abound. Emotions are crucial and important in world politics. So if we step back from the in-depth cases, and we step back from the book as a whole in general and try to think of like, what is it about emotions, about trauma, that is actually something that forces us to change the way in which we understand world politics? Just to ask a hard question at the very end.
Well, I guess my book, it really has sort of two big key messages and probably one more specific. The first of all is that emotions are absolutely central to world politics. There's been growing work in this area and I draw upon and contribute to it, but we really need a lot more work done in the area. Emotions, as I show in the book, emotions are an inherent part of human life, of social life. Emotions help to structure the very social systems and political system through which world politics takes place. And it's precisely because of that that emotions underpin all forms of political perception, policies and behaviours, and we really need much more work done in the area. I guess the second key point is the power of trauma in world politics and the central role trauma and traumatic legacies play in constituting communities and in turn collective actions in world politics. The third point, which is probably more specific, is really about the role representations play in this process, and essentially how representations and the range of discursive practices through which we interpret representations, how representations are central and key to the links between individual and collective emotions, and also between individual and collective trauma. So representations are central to shaping what seem to be individual emotions in very social, collective and political ways, and representations are also fundamental to how trauma, which is experienced in such an embodied, ineffable way, can seep out and be social, collective and political. Yeah.
It's fascinating talking to you because I can tell that amount of work and passion and emotions that have gone into writing this book. It's a fascinating read. Congratulations again on this wonderful publications. And if you have started getting an interest in the book, which I hope you did by listening to Emma and me talking about it, you can find the link to the book underneath this video. You can also find the link to the website of the School of Political Science and International Studies if you're interested in some of the other research we are doing in here. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time.